Welcome and good morning, everyone. This is our Monday morning webinar on the renovation of historical buildings. Thanks for joining. I'm Céline Carré. I'm Head of Public Affairs with Saint-Gobain. I'm the President of EuroACE, and I'm very happy to moderate this event with you this morning. This webinar is being organized by EuroACE. You can move to the next slide. Yes. As many of you know, EuroACE represents the voice of solutions and services for energy efficiency in buildings. And we have 15 members. We represent over 220,000 employees across Europe. And our purpose is to create the enabling framework to secure that buildings are energy efficient, don't waste energy, and we do that by explaining the benefits of energy efficiency, including the systemic ones, and by reminding the cost of non-action on that topic. Energy efficiency has been recognized as the first fuel by the International Energy Agency, but there is still a lot of work to treat it in this way and to make that concrete. This is our second webinar linked to the Fit for 55 and revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. You see here, you can have access to the replay of our first webinar, which was about the place of buildings in this whole package EU Fit for 55. And today, we are going to dive into the topic of energy renovation of historical buildings and how it is linked to this package, how with this, with those revisions of EU directive, we can better enable such renovation accounting for the specificities of historical and heritage buildings. So today, I'm very happy to introduce our three speakers. There is some reshuffling on our agenda. So first, we're going to have Adrian Joyce. Don't need to introduce Adrian. He's an architect by training, Secretary General of EuroACE and the Director of the Renovate Europe campaign. And Adrian will provide us with a short introduction into the policy context and how the topic of renovation of historical building has been framed in a few member states and projects. And then we're going to look into practical solutions and strategies for the renovation of historic buildings. First with Marco Mari, who is the President of the Italian Green Building Council. Marco was trained as an engineer in Bologna University, where he's still teaching on topics related to sustainability, building design, and climate change. And he has numerous experiences in the sector and on those topics, and a passion for green and sustainable buildings. And then we can have some insights regarding the work of the IEA by Alexandra Troi. She's the vice head of the Institute for Renewable Energy at Eurac in Bolzano, and she has a background as electrical engineer with some detailed work in her PhD on church heating. And her research interest has developed into the energy retrofit of historic building. And she's still teaching in a master course on digital technologies in conservation. And also as a practical reminder, most of you know how this GoToWebinar works. You can use the Q&A on the top of right of your screen. And in case that doesn't work, still use the chat function. And we are here with the rest of the EuroACE team to assist with this webinar, including Aphrodite. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Céline, and good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here to talk about the position of historic buildings in legislation, national plans, and some projects. In the expectation that I can set the scene for our two great speakers that are going to come after me. Next slide, please. From a policy perspective, the main challenges appear to me that there are multiple definitions across the EU and in each member state of what an historic or heritage building means. And it's very much a subsidiarity competence to define those buildings across the EU. And when you look at the numbers of those buildings, some sources would say that up to 30% of their building stock is historical or heritage buildings. And in many cases, there's a perception that these buildings cannot be touched in terms of an energy renovation project. So one of our challenges is to raise awareness of the extensive knowledge that exists on deploying energy efficiency measures in historic buildings without having a negative impact on their cultural and heritage quality, but improving the living conditions for the occupants of those buildings. Next slide, please. So beyond that perception I've just referred to, I would say that the reality is that across our wonderful continent, there are many, many examples of successful energy renovation projects for historic and heritage buildings. They come in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west. It really is a knowledge that's spread fully across the EU. And on the right-hand side here, you see three sources. When you receive the slides after the event, there's a hyperlink behind each logo, bringing you to resources on what we have it's just a selection of resources on what researchers have put together, demonstrating that in reality, historic and heritage buildings can be touched. And in the reality, many different typologies of buildings, from private homes through public libraries to commercial spaces, are all being represented in energy renovation projects. In addition, multiple guidance documents exist that have been published not only by research institutes, but by member state governments that are helping all building owners in this sector to understand that, yes, there's quite a lot that can be done to improve my historical or heritage building. And I will demonstrate shortly that many member states are funding this energy renovation through their long-term renovation strategies, and indeed in their national recovery and resilience plans. So next slide, please. In a quick look across the long-term renovation strategies, we found that Germany, its development bank KfW, has been providing subsidies for heritage buildings over quite a period of time. In Slovenia, there are specific categories of protected buildings which are to be renovated under the long-term renovation strategy submitted to the European Commission. In Croatia, there's a target that by 2040, each year, 4% of buildings with cultural value will be renovated each year in Croatia. And in Malta, an island nation with fantastic architectural heritage, specific grants are available for privately owned heritage buildings to be included. So you see, the long-term renovation strategies are including all types of buildings, public buildings, private buildings, and so on. Next slide, please. In the Renovate Europe analysis of the National Recovery and Resilience Plans, we also had the opportunity to look to see what sums of money member states have been promising towards historical and protected buildings. Again, a selection. In Slovakia, 130 million between now and 2025 is promised. In Croatia, it's 40 million to the renovation of heritage buildings. Here in Belgium, where I sit, 40 million has been allocated for the renovation of, but in this case, public heritage buildings. And in Romania, reforms are underway to devise non-invasive approaches to the renovation of their heritage building stock. So developing those guidance documents that I spoke about. But on the harder side, next slide, please, what have we been seeing in terms of the evolution of thinking in EU legislation? So I'm going to quickly look at the two key directives in the energy efficiency field, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive first, and the Energy Efficiency Directive briefly second. So when we look at the proposal for the Buildings Directive revision that's currently under negotiation, we find that the European Commission had proposed to delete the blanket exemption of heritage and historical buildings from renovation requirements. And in the Cuff report, so Kieran Cuff, who is the lead parliamentarian negotiating on behalf of the European Parliament, he has suggested that the new national building renovation plans have to have a specific quantification of protected buildings. So we gather that data reliably across the EU. And he specifically calls for protected buildings to reach a Class D level in the period between now and 2050. So recognition that we can undertake works to these buildings in a sensitive, in a good way to, as I said earlier, improve the conditions in those buildings. In the Environment Committee of the European Parliament, the CANEV report called for specific guidelines to be developed by member states for protected buildings. But in a few moments, I'll show you that some member states have already undertaken that work. Next slide. In the other directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, we see again that the Commission had proposed to delete the blanket exemption for heritage and historical buildings under the new Article 6 on public buildings. And in the Parliament, Niels Fugslang report has said that the exemption can only apply if works would unacceptably alter the character and cultural value of the building. And Marco and Alexandra may like to comment on that afterwards, but certainly as an ex-practicing architect, I would never wish to be part of a project that would unacceptably alter the character of our cultural value of the buildings. But also as an ex-practicing architect, I know that there are many, many measures that can be taken without that negative impact. In the European Council, so that's the member state negotiators, their option to exempt historical buildings from reaching zero emission building level is included in their common approach. So the negotiations are still going on, still live. We will see at the end of the day what actually comes out from the negotiations on those two directives. So maybe just turn to a couple of quick examples that are taken from the Renovate Europe exhibition that took place in 2019 in the European Parliament. Here in Spain, a beautiful old cast iron market building was renovated. I think you can see the photo shows a beautiful structure with its heritage character intact. But here we saw a 75% reduction in energy demand. Constructed in 1880, renovated 2016. Next slide. In Italy, a large residential building, which was constructed in 1905 with architectural features, as you see on its surface, with pediments and beautiful balconies. Top left before, bottom right, the larger picture after. This was renovated in 2019. I think you can see that the character of the building has been fully retained. And finally, in the Netherlands, an industrial, it in fact used to be a railway shed building, has been transformed into a community centre with a 54% reduction in its energy demand, again, constructed pre-Second World War, 1932, and renovated in 2019. So let me leave you with my last slide, which just lists a couple of links for guidance. And in my home country of Ireland, there has been a long tradition of producing guidance on energy efficiency in traditional buildings, dating back to 2010 and 2012. And at the present moment, a new report on deep energy renovation of traditional buildings to address knowledge gaps and skills training is recently published. In France, there's an organization called EPBD, and they have a label for heritage buildings, and they will give guidance on the website behind my hyperlink. And the UK, although sadly no longer in the EU, have a very good guidance on responsible renovation. It's called the Guidance Wheel, with 50 measures set out in a way that you can combine the different measures in a sensitive way depending on the character of your building. So Céline, I hope I've demonstrated that actually this is an area that deserves more attention. It's an area where we can achieve some good results, and an area that we should not be shy of when we're legislating for energy efficiency in buildings. So back to you, Céline.
Thanks, Adrian, for this introduction, already giving us the appetite to know more. So now let us turn to Marco Mari, who is going to introduce the the work of the Italian Green Building Council on the historical building certification. Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Céline. I hope you can hear well. And thank you to invite us in this interesting discussion. I think the first point is to let us aware about what we are doing in Italy. But I think it's important to starting defining and have a clear idea of the complex system that is a building, And so, next slide, please. So first, let me introduce GBC Italia. Green Building Council Italia is a profit association, and we are working hard inside the European Regional Network of World GBC, and the idea is to achieve a world more healthier, safer, and comfortable and efficient environment and for every people, so for everyone. So this is our idea, and to do this we need to work all together. And next slide, please. First, I think it's important to focus on the building impact. Building impact is not only energy, is waste, is CO2 emission, potable water, is material. Very well that the circular economy approach is well defined in this chain. But it's not only about environment, it's related to people, that we work and live inside the building. So designing for people and designing for comfort and healthy places is so important. But this is, we can say, a point of view that is not complete. And the reason why is that we need to be aware that there are some other aspects, and the cultural heritage is one of these. If you stop in the building impact only about energy and environment, you can demolish all the buildings around the world and construct maybe something zero something. But the idea is not to lose our roots. And our roots is really important. It's important to not to do war, for example. It's important to share with the other people our knowledge, our ways of living. And it's for sure a value. So we need to consider a building as a whole and as a system, and cultural heritage is a part of this. Next slide, please. The other side, we know very well that the chain of building, the built environment, achieve more than 11 directly sustainable goals on 17. So it's important to do something for all these building and the heritage building too. Next slide, please. How we can do, how we can, may I, can I have the next slide, please? Oh, thank you. So the other important thing is to think about building, not only in the process of renovation. We need to think building like a product that must live a lot of time. We need to extend the life of the building, and it's important because we need to be less impactful on the environment, for sure. But if we extend the period of life of buildings, something more raise. And the traditional building comes in the year to be something more important of the building itself. Next slide, please. And if we think about circular, if we think about a circular approach on building, I think there is nothing to reinvent. We know very well which is the way to follow. This is an ancient church, something like many in Italy and in Europe for sure, and we are able to reuse product materials and so on. And then this mixture of culture, of period, let us have a more interesting and more full of concept architecture. Next slide, please. So how we can bridge the gap between energy and environment and heritage preservation. We defined in Italy a very strong path about this. We started in defining a new protocol, a new energy environmental protocol, starting from LEED protocols, international green building protocols, and we added values and the idea of heritage and preservation and that kind of practice. Can I have the next slide, please? We started from the thinking that sustainability is an important part, but it's not the only one. And for us, restoration and refurbishment of building is sustainable when allows future generations to recognize the same cultural and environmental value that we can recognize today. So we defined an energy environmental protocol, but with more specific credits and are in thematic area. Can I have the next slide, please? We structure GBC story building on the general basis of energy environmental protocol, adding some parts, historic value, for example. This is really important because in any case, if we do not understand it, we do not know very well the ancient building, for sure we are not able to renovate, and for sure maybe we can break it. So this kind of work, this kind of accountability process, let understand that in the designing phase, in the refurbishment phase, all the actors to be aware of the ancient value. So this kind of value can be preserved, and we can push, maybe sometimes not too much for energy side, but in circular economy side and in some other, to have a better performance value. So next slide, please. When we can apply this kind of protocol and these activities to pre-industrial architecture, so that means pre-industrial process, material, and building elements. And we have a lot all over the Europe for sure, and we have a lot of this kind of building in the Mediterranean area too. So this is something that we can renovate, refurbish, preserve, and then we can operate with that building. For example, in Italy, there is an interesting activity related to renovation of ancient sites, something like, sites where the company failed, with problems, and a new kind of company raised in this period. That is the data center. So the new activity for data is really important because they have a lot of activity to do. They have a very good part of the business, and they can embrace this kind of sustainability refurbishment. So next slide. We have a lot of examples about this in Italy. This is an ancient jail, is certified, thank you. This is the second one. The first one was in Ferrara, in Emilia-Romagna region. This is in Torino. This is the Bank of Santander. This is another really important in Ferrara too, Palazzo Gulinelli, an ancient building that achieved a very high level of energy efficiency, and not only in the refurbishment. Next slide, please. And we have some beautiful places. This is a castle and is registered for the certification for the refurbishment with GBC Story Building 2. Next slide. This is an ancient church, really interesting, destroyed by the 2012 earthquake in the Emilia-Romagna region. Only a part was destroyed, and now is refurbishment. They are trying to reconstruct, but with the all attention for heritage. Next one. And this is the other slide. Thank you. This is really interesting because it's in Rome. It was a beautiful place where a technical problem, make the ceiling go down, and and the refurbishment and the restoration of the building was a very strong achievement, and all that kind of building have inside all we know about buildings and digitalization too. For example, this and the other one was achieved. They achieved the refurbishment with digitalization of the process too. This is a really perfect building, Museo of Galleria Borghese in Rome, and they are achieving now the certification on GBC Story Building. Next one, please. Oh, this is another one, is in the front of the Colosseum, and is the property is of the Minister of the Culture. You can go on, and is registered for the certification too. Next one, please. And this is really interesting because we have to follow something new, and to follow an innovation, we need to start from the heritage side. This is a small village, an historic monarch in Rocca Santa Apollinare in Perugia, and it's the first certified in GBC Story Building. I think if we are looking for the 50-minute city, if we are looking for a new ways of have the pleasure to live in a big city, maybe we can start to thinking on what the good living is and how we can merge heritage and sustainability. In any case, it is going to be an interesting idea. Next one, please. We are closing the presentation. I think it's important. The next one, please. It's important to remind all of us that we are internationalizing the GBC Story Building Protocol. There is an international call, and I hope all of you, and you are welcome to join us to start some case studies in Europe. Next one, the first case study was in, please, next slide. Yes, the first case study was in Cuba. We performed an interesting activity in La Habana. Next one, please. But we are working in some other case studies in Spain now, in UK, and so on. So I think this can be an idea to follow this. I can close my my speech with something that is interesting. Italy, as you know, every European country, for any European country, is mandatory to have green public procurement processes. So in Italy, we define green public procurement for building, and it's mandatory, and green public procurement, and so the green public procurement process for heritage side too. And from this year, is mandatory. So I think we have a lot of experience about this, and I hope we can share with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, for this really exciting presentation, which will give us, as some people will head for summer holidays, some ideas and new interest to look into the buildings we may be able to visit. I turn to Alexandra now, who will explain about the projects she's been leading on this topic. Alexandra, the floor is yours. Yes, for a bit more than 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, for the possibility to talk to the group here, to discuss with it afterwards. Thanks a lot also to the two pre-speakers who I think prepared the ground for what I'm now talking about very well, and also very complementary to what I will say. I think you saw a lot of nice pictures. Some will follow here too. I think there is a strong agreement within the group that what we see, what we perceive in these buildings is something we really want to preserve for future generations. We took it from people before us, and we want to leave it and bring it forward to whom comes afterwards. What I will present you is coming out of a number of projects. On the one hand side, Task 59, Annex 76 of the International Energy Agency. And then it was also complemented by project partners from the Interreg Alpine Space project Atlas. These groups were trying to understand what is at the moment possible, what is being done, and how can we encourage good renovation, good energy retrofits, because I'm strongly supporting Adrian's remark beforehand. We know that there can be done a lot. Next slide, please. So one thing we developed within those projects, especially to show what we have been doing, is this atlas we called Historic Building Energy Retrofit Atlas. It's a website, and it compiles cases of building renovations that we consider exemplary. Maybe not perfect in every aspect, but good examples where people really were ambitious and tried to get good results, both in terms of heritage conservation and energy efficiency. And we tried to bring them there in a way that they inspire and foster coming future more energy retrofits. Next slide, please. So just to show you here a bit of the variety of buildings which are in, and pointing out these two aspects, these two souls of the project which kind of came together also in the project teams, this renovating toward net zero energy buildings. So really having an ambitious target, but looking at it from a very holistic point of view. So bring together design, efficiency, local use, renewables, materials, and so on. And what we also looked at is to have a wider definition of this worthy of preservation. We kind of based our work on the European standards 60 and 883 on the guideline on energy retrofit of historic buildings. And I think if we apply these standards, then the 30% Adrian mentioned come out. Yeah, if we think about not just the formally listed buildings, but if we think about all those buildings which do have values which people might want to preserve, then we reach actually these higher numbers. Next slide, please. And this is a kind of timeline with just some examples out of the HiBERatlas. It contains now around, I think it should be something between 70 and 80 cases. If I'm later on citing numbers, some of them are referred to a little bit earlier stage when we just were at 69, something like that. But still, it is growing. And what you see here is that actually there are buildings from all periods. There are also buildings of all kinds, small ones, big ones, residential ones, office buildings, school buildings, everything a bit. Next slide, please. And this is what I actually pointed out beforehand. We wanted not to address only the listed buildings, but the wider range of buildings worthy of preservation. And what we saw actually with all the partners gathering in their networks, in their surroundings, the best practice cases, is that actually 50% of the documented best practice cases are officially protected, either directly listed or part of a conservation area. The other 50% considered in their decisions the heritage aspects voluntary. Yeah, so there was a wish in those project teams to consider the heritage value, even if they were not forced to. Next slide, please. What you find in the HiBERatlas is, and I think this is important to point out, actually implemented projects. This is not feasibility studies. This is not something which is planned for the future. This is actually real refurbishments which have been implemented in the last, I think, more or less 10 years. We always pointed out that it's important that it is a whole building renovation, that it is not just coming one measure to be added, not just, this happens in practice often that as an owner, you have a first contact to one specific enterprise which proposes their solution, and then you kind of are stuck and you have or just the PV plant, or you have just new windows, or you have just done some small parts. But I think it's important, or the whole consortium thought it's important that you look at the whole building and you find solutions for the whole building. And then, of course, it might depend on the building, and you will end up with one solution only because it's the only feasible. Then this is result of a bigger process. It was important for us that the projects were both ambitious in terms of bringing the energy demand down, and ambitious also in evaluating the heritage compatibility of the solutions. And then, of course, we looked for cases where actually the documentation of also technical solutions was available. I think it's important that we do not just discuss how we treat the listed buildings in the EPBD, but also how we make sure that this big number of buildings worthy of preservation is not lost. Next slide, please. How is it now documented? It starts with images, and then it brings some key aspects, key figures. This is a bit because we think that keeping historic buildings in use can only be done if we show that they are actually attractive living space, and this is finally the best way to protect them. So the images just to trigger people to say, oh, I want this too for my building. Yeah. Next slide, please. Then the next section actually looks at the architecture, at the building which is there, at its values. It tries to explain in simple words and with images what are the heritage values, what are the important things to preserve, what is maybe also the condition of the envelope before the intervention, what were the specific needs. So looking at the whole building and its values, its status. Next slide, please. And only after that, we actually go to the solutions. Yeah, they come after we have understood the buildings, and it looks at solutions of the envelope, of the windows, roof, ground floor, and you see that most of these short description here have two paragraphs, one describing the intervention and one explaining why this intervention was possible, was energy conservation compatible in this specific case. If you're talking about historic buildings, we cannot just copy without analyzing what has been done in one building to the next one. But there is a good potential that if we understand why it fitted there, we can understand whether it fits also for our building. And then, of course, we tried again here to have it with as many building photos, images, also from construction site and so on, to make it understandable what was actually done. Next slide, please. You see here the whole variety of interventions which were done, and you see also that it is not the same in each building. Yeah, there are different things which can be done. It will depend on the single building what is feasible there. And I think I would support very much also Marco Mari's position beforehand. I think if we are looking at historic buildings, we actually should look at more than just the energy renovation or the energy aspects. It is a variety of values. It includes the heritage values. It includes also looking at the whole life cycle. And I think heritage has quite an experience in looking at life cycles. So there might also be something to learn from society, from heritage. Next slide, please. And the last part of the HiBERatlas is actually bringing together some numbers. It looks at, for example, what was reached in terms of indoor comfort, what was reached also in terms of energy consumption. And next slide, please. Yeah, you see here a similar image than we saw beforehand with the buildings over the timeline. And the next slide, please. And if you might have expected that the older, the more difficult to refurbish them, I have to say, no, it's not necessary like that. Yeah, you see here the energy demand which was reached after the renovation, and you see that it more or less goes, it changes all over the period. And the range you might reach is also different. So I'm always a bit hesitating when for a minimum requirement is asked. I see a drawback in terms of it might be too demanding for some buildings, but at the same time, it might not be ambitious enough for others. And it would be a pity if those others stop thinking too early. Next slide, please. I did not mention beforehand, I had there also the comment, we need a negotiation space. If you could find a formalization to have such a negotiation space, this would be actually what would be really helpful. Yeah, thanks for going back. Okay, now briefly just how can you look for the cases? On the one hand side, just with keywords. Next slide, please. Then there are filters which look at specific aspects which you can use. And finally, next slide, please. There is also a map where you can actually look at maybe similar buildings in your area, in similar climate zones, and all these things. What you see a bit from this building, from this map, and from the many pictures we have here is that conservation compatible energy retrofit is possible. The number of documented buildings, I think, is already high, and there are still a lot out there which are good examples, which should and could be documented in the HiBERatlas to be made available to others. Next slide, please. It was up to now, as I mentioned, this Atlas project and the IEA task. The whole thing was done from the beginning in a way that it has a back office which is usable by others. So I would really look forward if more cases are being integrated in the database, if this is growing and becomes an everyday tool for also heritage authorities, consulting potential and people interested in a compatible energy retrofit in approaching it the right way. Next slide, please. This is just to point out that when we looked in the IEA project at these different cases, we also tried to summarize it. So if somebody wants to look a bit more into what I presented today, there are different parts in this report. On the one hand side, short summaries of the whole buildings, different explanations of the process of peer review we always had the conservation responsible expert and the technical expert looking at the cases. And I think this is important because both aspects are needed. And you also try to have different graphs, charts, and so on, showing what can be done. And I think we can, with the next slide, we are more or less already concluding. We can skip that. It's just showing that it is used all over the world, not just in Europe. This gives the hint on the variety. Next slide, please. And yeah, maybe click 2 times more. Yeah, okay, now it should come. With this slide, I close with these 2 citations from Franz Timmermans on the one hand side, saying that it will be one of our greatest challenges to convert the historic buildings in our centuries-old cities for a sustainable future. And Ursula von der Leyen, who pointed out the new European Bauhaus also as one of the tools, one of the spaces where actually including whole society, we can work together to make that happen. And with saying that, actually, I think the experience of heritage with keeping, repairing, looking at more than just 30 years life's building use can be something which is useful for the whole building sector. And it would be great if we can make use of that. I liked a lot last year's Pritzker's Prize, going to Lacaton Laval with their mention, never demolish, never remove, always add, transform, reuse. This is kind of, yeah, the mantra with which I would close my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. This is, again, very inspiring also to see all the work that has been done into gathering and preserving the data and the history related to those projects. This is very rich, and I think that merits to be further disseminated. So now we have a little time for questions and answers. So to all participants, you can still table your question in the dedicated little box on the GoToWebinar tool. We already have one question, which is to Marco, and this is about because you mentioned the green public procurement in Italy at the end of your presentation. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about how that interacts with your work and the Interland Green Building Council, and maybe a bit more about how this green public procurement has developed. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for the question, Céline. We are working with the Minister of Environment and Minister of Culture in different projects about this. We, you know, in Italy, the green public procurement, minimum environmental criteria that are mandatory for green public procurement and mainly for buildings are defined some years ago. And we worked with the environmental minister to put clearly the way to account that process with energy and environmental protocol. We're now reinventing, you know, the wheel. We're now reinventing process of the accountability and trying to simplify the approach from the private and the public sector, because you know that if you change the owner of the building from private to public, doesn't mean that the building works better or worse. You know, the building is the performance of the building are the same, or maybe it must be improved in any case. So that was the first activity. Then we started to work with the Minister of Culture in Italy to have some case study, very structured, and applying these to beautiful building. One of that is studied and is going to be complete, I hope, in a few years, with the refurbishment of a building that is Palazzo Poli. It's in Rome. Palazzo Poli have in the one side have the Fontana di Trevi. You know, so it's something really incredible. Now, for example, we define it with the municipality of Rome, a beautiful restoration of a magnificent park, Villa Ada, 250 hectares of the park with inside 3 historic buildings. They are working for the side of GBC historic building for that building, but they are they are interested to work with us with another protocol for green infrastructure called sites. And the friends of sites, the United States friends, are really interested to work with us in the heritage side of sites. So doing this, we have a community growing, a thinking growing, and I think it's important to work together for this. So I think the possibility, the instrument, the knowledge is now of something that we can use, we can achieve, and working in this, we convinced the environmental minister that we can do it mandatory in the same for historic building too. As Alexandra told us before, it's not only a matter of energy, but energy is an important part. In any case, this holistic approach is something that is really important when you think of material products, when you think of circular economy, when you think of wellness and healthy places, and so on. So all this activity now is conversing to an objective, and I tell you the news that is really important. We are working a working group with the Minister of Infrastructure and Mobility and Sustainable Mobility to define the project of feasibility. The minister is working and asked us to coordinate in that working group to structure the energy and environmental protocol in the thinking of public administration for feasibility study for public buildings. So I think maybe because we have a long period working on this, that now it's really important. It's important to work all together because we need to be aware about our possibility. And the internationalization process of the protocol is not only to do certification all over the world, but is to find a bridge with the other culture in Europe to work together on this.
Thank you, Marco. It is indeed interesting to see the interactions between and the collaboration that is being developed both in Italy and the internationalization on that topic. Let me now turn to Alexandra, because this work on with the IEA and the Annex has also involved lots of actors, and it's very rich. Do you think that this is sufficiently known by decision makers, and maybe what would you suggest about it to help maybe better dissemination? Because as soon as people realize all the work that has been done, the data, the instruments, probably it can facilitate stepping into the jungle of renovating historical buildings.
Yes, of course. I hope that it is already known by quite some and will be known to more. So that's also maybe one of the reasons why I very happily used the occasion to talk here, because I think this is something which just has to be spread out, to be shown. Thanks to the work in the IEA task, which has the structures of having national members in the EXCO committee and so on, I think there is already a link to the single countries, at least, who are contributing to these tasks. Of course, you usually also always feel you have not done enough. Yeah, I think there are quite some we worked a lot with Twitter, and it worked quite nice. We worked both with the energy side and the conservation side, so we have good links to the ECOMOS scientific committee on energy and sustainability. So I think that sector should be aware about what is there. People who are interested might also check out the Task 59 website. So there are a lot of webinars where we have with more or less detailed explained results, which maybe comes to my mind still as one more tool, which I did not mention in the presentation beforehand. There I was actually mentioned about this HiBERatlas, which presents the buildings. From there, on the upper part, there is also a link to the HiBER tool, which actually looks at the variety of solutions you can apply. So it comes more from a solutions point of view, and it tries to guide the potential owner with questions about the building to kind of narrow the possible solutions he might look at. So it does not ending up with saying, do this, but it ends with saying, okay, you might consider this and this and that. So that's maybe also something which is, yeah, helpful for the single one. Not sure whether this answered your question, Céline.
Yes, it does, and it gives some ideas. I mean, having in mind the EU policy context and the EPBD, because it could go in the direction of what is being already developed in the field of building renovation passport, where you draw recommendation and a specific roadmap for upgrading a building on the basis of, as you describe, its actual conditions. And that's where the questionnaire maybe could go. I mean, that's just one idea. Thanks for that, and we will be happy to also integrate this in the document after this webinar.
Maybe,
Marco?
Céline, we can focus on something not so something that is important from the European side. One is taxonomy report and taxonomy activities, you know, and the principles of do not significant harm are something really interesting from the heritage point of view. You know that you need to improve some aspects, but you be aware not to harm with other, and this is the right focus activity on refurbishment of historic building. The real problem is not to enhance a part and not to lose something other. So I think, and we think very, very hard, that is really important to be that kind of approach. Do not significant harm in historic building is the right way. So if you have in the same time an accountability process about that gave you a clear idea of how much you are able to improve energy and environmental aspects and cultural aspects too, I think is really important. The last help from Europe is the new Bauhaus thinking. I think it's so important to put culture inside our renovation processes, and heritage is culture itself.
Okay, thank you, Marco, for those remarks. We're going to have to conclude, but we will keep in mind what you have just mentioned, including indeed the taxonomy, which is going further than the regulatory, I mean, the policy framework of the EPBD, but also rich of ideas on the cultural dimension of the new European Bauhaus. We are reaching our time. I would like to warmly thank all of you, Alexandra, Marco, and Adrian, for your time and your interventions today. I will keep a few takeaways very briefly from this webinar. One is the diversity of the buildings we are talking about, which we should not forget when talking about historical buildings in relation to policy making is different realities, cultures, and also potentials as well. The second point I would like to underline is about the know-how that has been developed. We have extensive experience in this field. We've seen it from different geographies and data. So, and very concrete instruments as well are available. And that means that it needs to be shared and disseminated to public authorities dealing with the topic and anyone wanted to go further. And the last one is that it goes beyond energy efficiency, obviously. So that means that we have even more opportunities and more reasons to upgrade, renovate those buildings and preserve what is coming from history. And so, in a nutshell, I think that policies developed in the frame of the EED and the EPBD needs to account for this diversity, this know-how, and the fact that there are lots of opportunities to renovate those buildings. We will further think about all of this, digest and assess how we can best support the discussions that are going to take place on these topics in the autumn and beyond within EuroACE. So the replay of this webinar will be made available very soon, and you can further reach out to us and to the speakers, obviously, if you didn't have time to table your question. I thank you very much for your participation, and see you at next webinar, which will be announced soon in September. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Céline.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, Céline. Bye, Alexandra. Bye, Adrian.
Bye.
Thank you.